Bernie Madoff's trial process was swift because he pled guilty, choosing not to fight the charges, not to contest the facts, not to put his family through a lengthy public trial, though whether this decision was motivated by remorse or by a desire to... On March 12, 2009, just 3 months after his arrest, Bernie stood before Judge Denny Chin in federal court in Manhattan and pled guilty to 11 counts, including securities, fraud, investment advisor, fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, perjury, and making false filings with a C key. And when Judge Chin asked if he had committed these crimes, Bernie said yes, and when asked if he understood he was facing a maximum sentence of 150 years in prison, Bernie said yes, and the proceeding took less than... With Bernie admitting guilt, but showing no visible emotion, no tears, no apparent remorse, just a calm acceptance of his fate. Sentencing came 3 months later on June 29, 2009, and it was a moment of high drama, with the courtroom packed with victims who had come to see justice served, to see Bernie punished, to tell the judge how his crimes had affected their lives. And one by one victims spoke, many elderly, many crying, telling stories of life savings lost, retirement plans destroyed, having to go back to work in their 70s, losing their homes, their security, their ability to help children and grandchildren, all because they trusted Bernie Madoff. Judge Chin listened to the victim impact statements, reviewed the present-tensing report, considered the magnitude of the crime and the devastation it had caused, and then he delivered a sentence that made headlines around the world: 150 years in prison, the maximum possible sentence, ensuring that Bernie Madoff, then 71 years old, would die in prison, would never again walk free, would spend every remaining day of his life behind bars paying for his crimes. In pronouncing the sentence, Judge Chin said that Bernie's crimes were extraordinarily evil and represented a breach of trust on a massive scale, that Bernie had stolen from widows and orphans, from charities and foundations, from friends and family members, that he had shown no remorse, and had demonstrated through his actions a complete disregard for the suffering he caused, and that the sentence needed to reflect not only the magnitude of the financial loss, but also the human cost, the trust betrayed, the lives destroyed, and the message that needed to be sent that such crimes would be punished with the maximum severity available under law. Bernie was immediately remanded to custody and sent to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, and later transferred to Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina, a medium-security prison where he would spend the rest of his life. But the consequences extended far beyond Bernie himself, destroying his entire family in ways that make this story even more tragic. Because whether or not his family members knew about the fraud, and the evidence suggests most of them didn't know, they paid enormous prices for Bernie's crimes. His wife Ruth, who had worked at the firm in the early years and had been married to Bernie for 50 years, claimed she knew nothing about the fraud, and investigators found no evidence she was involved in the criminal enterprise. But she lost everything anyway. Her reputation destroyed, her social standing evaporated, many of her friends and family members refusing to speak to her, forced to surrender virtually all her assets to help compensate victims, left with just $2.5 million from the billions the family had accumulated, living in Connecticut in relative isolation, a pariah blamed by association even if not legally culpable. Bernie's two sons, Mark and Andrew, who worked at the legitimate trading side of the business, and who investigators concluded did not know about the investment advisory fraud, faced suspicion, lawsuits, investigations, and public condemnation that ultimately destroyed both of them. Mark Madoff, the older son who had turned his father in to authorities, struggled with depression, guilt, and the constant scrutiny and accusations. And on December 11th, 2010, exactly 2 years after Bernie confessed to him, Mark hanged himself in his Manhattan apartment, while his 2-year-old son slept in the next room, leaving a suicide note saying he couldn't live with the shame and the accusations and the destruction of his life, and his death was a direct consequence of his father's crimes. Even though Mark himself had done nothing wrong, had in fact done the right thing by reporting the fraud. Andrew Madoff, the younger son, fought to clear his name, cooperated with investigators, tried to rebuild his life. But the stress and the trauma took a physical toll, and he was diagnosed with cancer, mantle cell lymphoma, which he had beaten once before, but which returned after his father's arrest. And doctors believed the stress of the scandal contributed to the cancer's return. And Andrew died on September 3rd, 2014. At age 48, another victim of Bernie's crimes, another life destroyed by the fraud. And he died estranged from his father, having refused to speak to Bernie after the fraud was revealed, having publicly said that Bernie was dead to him, that he could never forgive what his father had done to him, to his brother, to thousands of innocent people. Bernie himself showed little visible remorse even after being sentenced, giving interviews from prison where he claimed he didn't think he was evil, just stupid, where he minimized his crimes by saying that his clients were greedy and should have known the returns were too good to be true, where he blamed regulators for not catching him, where he suggested that victims should have diversified rather than investing everything with him, essentially blaming everyone but himself, showing a narcissism and lack of empathy that made his crimes even more disturbing. He died in prison on April 14th, 2021, at age 82 of natural causes, having served less than 12 years of his 150-year sentence. And when news of his death was announced, many victims said they felt no satisfaction, no closure, no sense that justice had truly been served, because Bernie had taken the easy way out, had died relatively peacefully, while many of his victims were still suffering the financial and emotional consequences of his fraud more than a decade later. The Bernie Madoff scandal taught us, or should have taught us, critical lessons about financial regulation, about due diligence, about trust and verification, about how fraud flourishes in environments where reputation substitutes for scrutiny, where people want to believe so badly that they ignore obvious warning signs, where regulators are either incompetent or captured by the industries they're supposed to police. And yet more than a decade later, we continue to see similar frauds, similar failures, similar situations where people who should know better get taken in by schemes that are obviously too good to be true. The first lesson is about the importance of skepticism, particularly when investment returns seem unusually good or unusually consistent. Because in real markets, volatility is normal, losses are inevitable, and anyone promising steady returns regardless of market conditions is either phenomenally skilled, which is extremely rare, or lying, which is much more common. And investors need to be willing to ask hard questions, demand proof, verify claims independently, rather than trusting based on reputation or relationships. The second lesson is about regulatory reform and the need for the SEC to be properly funded, properly staffed with people who have the expertise to understand complex financial instruments and trading strategies. and properly independent from the industries and individuals they regulate. Because the ECC's failure to catch Madoff despite multiple investigations and explicit warnings from Harry Markopolos represents a catastrophic breakdown in the regulatory system that was supposed to protect investors from exactly this kind of fraud. After the Madoff scandal, there were reforms, increased whistleblower protections, larger rewards for people who report fraud, more resources for investigating tips and complaints. But whether these changes are sufficient, whether the SEC has truly learned the lessons of its failure, whether similar frauds could happen again today, remains an open question that the financial industry and investors should be concerned about. The third lesson is about the importance of independent verification and transparency. Because Bernie operated in secrecy, refused to use independent custodians, employed a tiny unknown accounting firm, didn't allow investors to see actual trades or verify holdings. And these should have been automatic disqualifiers for any sophisticated investor or institution. Yet people invested anyway because they trusted Bernie's reputation, wanted access to his returns, and didn't want to offend him by demanding transparency. The lesson is clear. Never invest money without independent verification. Never accept secrecy as a condition of investing. Never trust reputation over proof, because as the saying goes, trust but verify. And in Madoff's case, nobody verified. Everyone just trusted, and that trust cost them $65 billion. The fourth lesson is about the human capacity for self-deception and the power of cognitive biases. Because many of Madoff's investors were sophisticated, intelligent, financially savvy people who should have known better but who fell victim to confirmation bias. The tendency to seek out information that confirms what we want to believe and ignore information that contradicts it. And to the halo effect, where we assume that someone who is successful or respected in one area must be trustworthy in all areas. Bernie cultivated this image carefully. His reputation as a NASDAQ chairman, an industry pioneer, created a halo that made people less likely to question his investment returns. And his exclusivity and selectivity made people feel privileged to invest with him, made them less likely to ask hard questions for fear of losing access. And these psychological factors were as important to the fraud's success as any of the technical aspects. The legacy of Bernie Madoff extends beyond the specific case to affect how we think about white-collar crime, about appropriate punishment, about whether financial fraud is taken seriously enough by the justice system. Because while Bernie got 150 years, many people involved in financial frauds receive much lighter sentences, serve minimal time. They emerge with their wealth largely intact and able to resume comfortable lives. And there's a widespread perception that white-collar criminals are treated with kid gloves compared to street criminals who commit far less damaging crimes but receive much harsher punishment. Bernie's case was unusual in the severity of the sentence. Judge Chin specifically wanted to send a message. But even then, Bernie served only 12 years before dying of natural causes. And many victims felt that wasn't enough, that true justice would have required Bernie to experience more suffering, more loss, more of the pain that he inflicted on thousands of people whose lives he destroyed. The Irving Picard, the trustee appointed to recover money for Madoff's victims, has worked for more than a decade to claw back funds from people who profited from the fraud, even if they didn't know it was a fraud. And this process has been controversial because it involves suing people who thought they had legitimately earned returns on their investments. People who had no idea they were receiving stolen money. But the legal principle is clear. Nobody has a right to keep money that was stolen, even if they received it innocently And so the trustee has recovered more than $14 billion through settlements and lawsuits, returning about 70% of the principal that victims invested, though nowhere near the full amount shown on their statements because most of those returns were fictitious, never actually existed, were just numbers on paper that Bernie made up. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Madoff case is how it reveals the fragility of trust in financial systems, because markets and investments fundamentally depend on trust, on the belief that statements are accurate, that trades are real, that returns are legitimate, that regulators are watching, that fraud will be detected and punished. And when that trust is violated as completely as Bernie violated it, when someone at the highest levels of Wall Street, someone with every credential and every connection and every reason to be trustworthy, turns out to be running a multi-decade fraud, it damages the entire system. It makes investors more skeptical, makes it harder for legitimate investment advisors to attract clients, creates paranoia and suspicion that can be as damaging as the fraud itself. Today, more than 15 years after the fraud was exposed, Bernie Madoff's name remains synonymous with financial fraud, with Ponzi schemes, with the dangers of trusting without verifying, and with the catastrophic damage that one person can do when motivated by greed and enabled by regulatory failure and willful blindness. His crimes destroyed thousands of lives, collapsed charitable organizations, traumatized an entire community, killed his sons either directly or indirectly, and left a legacy of suspicion and caution that may ultimately be healthy for financial markets but came at an enormous cost. The question that remains unanswered, that may never be fully answered, is why Bernie did it. What motivated him to continue the fraud year after year, decade after decade, even as he became wealthy from his legitimate business, even as he gained respect and status and influence. Why he couldn't stop, couldn't come clean, couldn't find a way out of the trap he had created for himself. And the answer probably lies in some combination of greed, ego, fear of failure, addiction to the respect that his false success brought him, and a psychological disconnect that allowed him to compartmentalize his crimes, to see himself as different from other criminals, to justify his actions as somehow less harmful than they were, right up until the moment when the whole house of cards finally collapsed and he had to face the truth of what he had done and who he had become. This has been the story of Bernie Madoff, the man who built a financial empire on lies, who ran the largest Ponzi scheme in history for possibly 50 years, who stole $65 billion from thousands of investors, including friends, family members, charities, and institutions that trusted him, who fooled regulators, auditors, and sophisticated investors who should have known better, whose fraud was enabled by regulatory failure, willful blindness, and the human tendency to believe what we want to believe, rather than confronting uncomfortable truths. The story of how the fraud finally collapsed in December 2008, when the financial crisis made it impossible to continue. How Bernie confessed to his sons, who turned him in. How he was arrested and charged and sentenced to 150 years in prison. How his family was destroyed. How his sons died. How thousands of victims lost everything. And how more than a decade later, we're still trying to understand how it happened. How it went on so long. How so many people missed so many warning signs. And what lessons we should learn to prevent the next Bernie Madoff from stealing billions before anyone notices. Because if there's one certainty in financial markets, it's that greed and fraud are constant, that there will always be people willing to lie and steal, and that our only protection is skepticism, verification, transparency, and regulation that actually works, rather than regulation that exists on paper, but fails in practice, which is what happened with Bernie Madoff, and which could happen again if we don't learn from this catastrophic failure of oversight, of due diligence, of basic human judgment about who to trust and why.